He just wanted to sit by the creek with her son. No noise, no fishing poles, just silence and healing. But the HOA fined her $750 in front of her grieving child. What they didn't know was that she had once negotiated billion-dollar deals. And this time, she wasn't walking away. She was buying the land beneath their feet. This is the story of how one quiet mother took down an entire HOA and rebuilt a community they tried to destroy. The pre-dawn light was still a faint whisper against the horizon when Amelia Hartwell guided her aging SUV down the winding two-lane road leading into Sunridge Meadows, her knuckles pale against the steering wheel, heart hammering harder than she cared to admit. In the passenger seat, her son Ethan, just 13, leaned heavily against the window, his breath fogging the glass and slow. Even rhythms, a backpack clutched loosely against his chest like a shield. Behind them, the rumbling moving van carried the remnants of a life they had abandoned piece by piece, the donated furniture, the boxed photographs, the wedding china wrapped in yellowed newspaper, all that remained after James's death had cracked their world apart. Amelia inhaled deeply, tasting the damp, clean scent of earth and new beginnings, forcing her mind to quiet the what-ifs and regrets gnawing at the edges of her resolve. This was supposed to be the fresh start she had promised Ethan during one of their sleepless nights, whispered into the dark when neither of them could find peace, a place where the grief that had hollowed them out would loosen its cruel grip and allow something new to take root. She could still hear her husband's laugh in the back of her mind, the way his hands had felt warm and calloused against hers the morning he left for the charity mission, the way he had kissed the top of Ethan's head before disappearing into the rain with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a promise to be back by Sunday. Sunday had come, but James had not. Now, Amelia carried the weight of that absence in every careful decision she made, every tentative step forward, every forced smile she painted onto her face for Ethan's sake. As they crested the final hill, Sunridge Meadows unfolded before them like a perfectly staged photograph, all gentle curbs and manicured hedges, pastel-painted mailboxes, and the glint of morning sun off the windows of uniform. Tasteful homes. At the heart of it all wound the creek, Sunridge Creek, a sparkling silver thread, weaving life into the neighborhood's pristine order. Its banks dotted with willows and wooden benches and promises of picnics and lazy afternoons spent beside the water. That creek had been the reason she chose this place over a dozen others. Not the community's glossy brochures about gated security or award-winning schools. Not the wide sidewalks or the decorative fountains, or the promises of social events and neighborly camaraderie. No, it had been the water, the memory of Ethan and James laughing together while fishing on summer weekends. The way James used to say that the world always made more sense beside a running stream. Amelia slowed to a stop in front of their new home, a modest two-story colonial with navy shutters and a small flagpole tilting slightly in the front yard, and turned to her son, reaching out to brush a stray curl from his forehead. "We made it, baby," she whispered, her voice catching despite herself. Ethan stirred, blinking groggily awake, his face still boyish but marked with the shadows of a young man who had seen too much sorrow too soon. He rubbed his eyes, taking in the unfamiliar street with a look of wary detachment, as though afraid to hope this time might be different, afraid to trust that new beginnings could be real. Amelia smiled through the sting in her chest, squeezing his hand lightly before stepping out into the morning air, which smelled faintly of cut grass and possibility. She stood there for a moment, letting the sounds of the waking world settle around her, the distant bark of a dog, the soft hum of sprinklers ticking to life, the muted clatter of a neighbor's garbage bin, and made herself a silent vow. Whatever it took, no matter how polished the surface of this place might be, she would protect Ethan's fragile healing. She would carve out peace here, even if she had to fight for every inch of it. And no smiling HOA president or whispered judgment or hidden hostility lurking behind neat hedges would take that away from them. She glanced once more at the silver ribbon of Sunridge Creek glinting in the distance, then squared her shoulders and moved to help Ethan gather the first of the boxes from the car, the future trembling just beyond their fingertips like a promise still waiting to be claimed. It was a week later when Amelia decided to organize a small, simple picnic by Sunridge Creek, an idea born from a desperate hope to anchor Ethan's fragile new beginnings to something joyful, something he could call his own in this unfamiliar world of manicured lawns and silent neighbors who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. She spent the morning carefully preparing sandwiches, slicing fresh fruit, and packing a weathered checkered blanket that had once seen countless family outings, before tragedy had turned their traditions into memories too sharp to touch. Ethan, who had been unusually quiet since their move, finally allowed a small smile to break across his face as they walked hand in hand toward the creek. The late spring sun warm on their backs and the air filled with the sweet, earthy scent of wildflowers growing unchecked along the banks. They found a shady spot near a willow tree where the roots dipped lazily into the water, the perfect place to unfold the blanket, kick off their shoes, and let the world outside this bubble of stolen peace disappear. Amelia watched as Ethan laughed, really laughed for the first time in months when he accidentally dropped a grape and it rolled down the slight hill into the creek, prompting him to chase after it with a theatrical stumble that sent them both into fits of giggles. For a moment, Amelia allowed herself to believe that perhaps this move had been the right choice after all, that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. The illusion shattered with the sudden, sharp snap of high-heeled footsteps on gravel. Amelia turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in an immaculately pressed golf shirt and tailored slacks striding toward them, a clipboard tucked under one arm and a scowl etched deep into his sun-reddened face. "Good afternoon," he said with a forced civility that dripped condescension like syrup, his gaze sweeping over their modest picnic setup as if assessing the scene for contamination. "I'm Bradley Summers, president of the Sunridge Meadows Homeowners Association. I couldn't help but notice you're improperly utilizing community green space." Amelia blinked, momentarily stunned by the sheer absurdity of the accusation. She rose slowly to her feet, brushing grass from her jeans, feeling Ethan's small hand instinctively seek hers. "We're just having a quiet lunch by the creek," she replied evenly, her voice laced with careful politeness. "There's no one else around. We're not leaving any trash, and we'll clean up after ourselves." Bradley offered a tight, humorless smile. "Be that as it may, all activities on common property must be approved in advance by the HOA. Picnicking, gathering, and recreational use of Sunridge Creek. These activities were formally prohibited under the new Community Enhancement Initiative ratified last month. Surely you received the email notifications." Amelia's heart sank as the implications crashed down around her. She had scanned every welcome packet, read every generic HOA notice about lawn maintenance and mailbox color schemes, but nowhere had she seen any mention of such an absurd rule. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, squeezing Ethan's hand tighter as she felt him tense beside her, "but I don't recall seeing anything about this." Bradley shrugged with theatrical sympathy. "Ignorance of regulations does not exempt residents from compliance. I'm afraid I'll have to issue a citation for this violation. Standard penalty is $750. He began scribbling onto his clipboard with mechanical efficiency, as if doling out punishments were just another item on his afternoon checklist, like picking up dry cleaning or scheduling a tea time. Amelia felt a flash of fury ignite in her chest, but she clamped it down, unwilling to let Ethan see her lose control. "Come on, Ethan," she murmured, beginning to fold up the blanket with shaky hands. "Let's pack up." Her son's face crumpled in confusion and hurt, the corners of his mouth twitching downward as he knelt to gather the uneaten sandwiches and abandoned paper plates. Bradley watched them with cool detachment, tapping the edge of his clipboard against his thigh, a king surveying subjects too lowly to warrant real attention. As they walked away from the creek, Ethan's voice broke the heavy silence, small and bewildered. "Mom, why was he so mad? We weren't doing anything wrong." Amelia swallowed hard against the lump rising in her throat, blinking against the sting of frustrated tears. "Sometimes," she said quietly, choosing each word with surgical care, "people hide behind rules when what they're really protecting is their own idea of who belongs and who doesn't." She didn't say what she truly felt, that this pretty, smiling place was not at all the sanctuary she had so desperately hoped it would be. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as she glanced down at Ethan, his young face shadowed with confusion and something heartbreakingly close to shame, Amelia made another silent vow, fiercer this time, carved into the bedrock of her heart like a battle cry. They would not be chased away. Not by arrogance, not by cruelty, not by a man in a golf shirt with a clipboard and a god complex. No, this was just the first shot fired in a war Amelia Hartwell hadn't known she was entering, and she intended to win. The days that followed unfolded with an eerie, calculated precision that left Amelia feeling as though she were navigating a stage play in which every smiling neighbor, every carefully trimmed hedge, and every pastel front door concealed a script she had never been handed. It started subtly, the way conversations with other parents at the community park would falter when she approached. The sidelong glances at Ethan as he tried to join the other children playing by the swing set. The brittle, too polite greetings exchanged over manicured fences. Amelia, who had spent her career reading financial markets and boardrooms filled with veiled power plays, recognized the signs of exclusion immediately, an invisible moat being dug around her family, one awkward encounter at a time. It was during a Tuesday afternoon walk along the winding paths that traced the edges of Sunridge Creek that she noticed the first real clue that something far more sinister than suburban cliquishness was at work. The wooden signs that once proclaimed community gathering area, welcome, had been replaced by sharp, official-looking plaques that read restricted area, no trespassing without HOA permit, mounted coldly onto polished steel posts. The benches where she had imagined reading books with Ethan under the lazy sun now bore small engraved warnings. Loitering prohibited. Violators subject to fine. It was as if the very spirit of Sunridge Meadows, the promise of open spaces and neighborly connection, was being surgically erased, replaced with a rigid, soulless regime of compliance and control, curiosity prickling at the edges of her growing unease. Amelia returned home and dug through the pile of HOA documents she had filed away in a drawer without much thought when they first arrived. Page after page of regulations blurred before her eyes. Specifications for lawn height, guidelines for approved exterior paint colors, bylaws about holiday decorations, but nothing explaining the sudden draconian shift regarding the common areas. Her frustration mounting, she logged into the community portal, a labyrinthine website buried under layers of bureaucratic jargon, and finally found it, an amendment passed by the HOA board less than a month prior, citing necessary measures to preserve community integrity and property values. No resident vote, no discussion, just a unilateral decree from the board, rubber-stamped by a handful of insiders whose names Amelia now recognized from the whispered alliances around the neighborhood. Bradley Summers, of course, but also two other board members whose wives seemed to helm the social gatherings from which Amelia and Ethan were conspicuously excluded. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, Amelia sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, reading and rereading the amendment language until the rage it kindled within her burned cold instead of hot. This wasn't about safety, or cleanliness, or aesthetics. It was about control. It was about power, and more than that, it was about defining who was deemed worthy of belonging and who was not. Amelia thought of Ethan's bewildered face after the picnic, the way he had hugged his arms around himself as if trying to make his body smaller, less offensive, less visible. The memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had moved here believing that this place would offer him sanctuary, a chance to rebuild the fragile foundations of his young life. Instead, she had walked them both into a gilded cage where the locks were hidden behind smiles, and the keys were jealously guarded by men like Bradley Summers. Amelia closed the laptop slowly, her reflection fractured across the darkened screen like a broken mirror. They had underestimated her, all of them. They thought she was just another single mother, just another transient outsider, too timid or too exhausted to fight back. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. She wasn't simply going to survive here. She was going to expose every rot hidden beneath their pristine facades and tear down their fortress of arrogance. One brick at a time if necessary. They had fired the first shot when they humiliated her son by the creek. Now it was Amelia's turn to prepare for war. It was a late Thursday afternoon when Amelia found herself wandering aimlessly past the edge of the main green, the sunlight slanting low and golden through the rows of carefully planted maple trees. Casting long shadows across the meticulously edged sidewalks, Ethan had gone to the community library for a school project, his first tentative step into reclaiming a semblance of normalcy, and Amelia, restless and unable to shake the feeling of simmering disquiet, had decided to explore the less manicured edges of Sunridge Meadows. She rounded a quiet corner near the maintenance sheds and spotted a man wrestling with a stubborn old bicycle. The chain slipped and tangled hopelessly. He was in his late 60s, lean and wiry, with a faded denim jacket over a neatly pressed shirt, his silver hair catching the sunlight like a halo of defiance. Something about the set of his shoulders, the quiet muttered curses at the rebellious bike, made Amelia smile despite herself. Acting on impulse, she crossed the grass toward him. "Need a hand?" she called out lightly. The man straightened, blinking in surprise, then offered a wry chuckle that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Only if you know the secret language of vintage Schwinns," he replied, his voice rich with dry humor. Amelia knelt beside him without hesitation, deftly lifting the chain back into place with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent many childhood afternoons fixing her brother's bikes. The man watched her for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded approvingly. "Name's Jonathan Pierce," he said, extending a grease-stained hand. "Been living here since the first homes went up 20 years ago. And you must be the new lady on Willow Bend Lane." Amelia laughed softly as she wiped her hands on a napkin from her pocket. Amelia Hartwell. And yes, guilty as charged. Something shifted in Jonathan's expression, then a flicker of something guarded, yet curious, as if he were weighing the risk of what to say next. "Heard about your little misunderstanding by the creek," he said carefully. Lowering his voice, though there was no one else around. "Word travels fast around here, especially when Bradley Summers wants it to." Amelia stiffened instinctively, but Jonathan held up a placating hand. "Don't worry, some of us see through the dog and pony show. We just learned the hard way to keep our heads down." He glanced around as if expecting invisible ears among the hedges. "But maybe," he added slowly, "it's time that changed." The air between them seemed to tighten, charged with the weight of unspoken truths. Amelia tilted her head, studying him. "I get the feeling, more than you're saying," she ventured. Jonathan's grin was quick and sharp, like a blade being unsheathed. "Let's just say, Bradley and his little court don't like people who ask questions, and people who refuse to bend." He shrugged. "They find themselves with fines, inspections, lawsuits, property values mysteriously tanking until they have no choice but to sell, usually to buyers conveniently connected to our dear HOA president." The pieces clicked into place so fast that Amelia nearly staggered. The tightening rules, the fabricated violations, the suffocating sense of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was a system, a strategy, a weapon disguised as community management. "And everyone just lets it happen," she whispered, horrified. Jonathan's eyes darkened, the lightness of their earlier banter disappearing. "Most folks are too tired, too scared. They just want to mow their lawns, send their kids to school, and keep the peace. They don't realize that by staying silent, they're letting the rot sink deeper." Amelia looked away, the bile rising bitter at the back of her throat. The image of Ethan's hopeful smile from the picnic flashing before her eyes like an accusation. "What about you?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite the rage coiling inside her. Jonathan's grin returned, slow and dangerous this time. "I stayed quiet long enough," he said simply. "Maybe it's time for a little noise." They exchanged a look then, a silent agreement forged not from friendship or trust, but from necessity, from the raw understanding that sometimes it only takes a few brave souls to start an avalanche. Jonathan tapped his chin thoughtfully. "You ought to meet Sophia Jameson," he said. "She's seen the dark underbelly of this place up close, and she's got a score to settle with Bradley, too." Amelia nodded, feeling the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope, not the naive, trembling kind she had clung to when she first arrived, but a harder, sharper hope, tempered by loss and betrayal, the kind of hope that could drive a woman to fight for the home she had promised her son, no matter what it cost. As she followed Jonathan back toward his garage, the sun dipped below the rooftops, throwing long, jagged shadows across the perfectly paved streets. Amelia squared her shoulders, the last golden rays catching the determination blazing in her eyes. They had started this war with a clipboard and a fine. She was going to finish it with something much stronger. The next day, Amelia found herself standing outside a modest but meticulously kept cottage near the northern edge of the neighborhood, its garden bursting with lavender and creeping rosemary that spilled gently over a white picket fence. Jonathan had arranged the meeting, insisting with a glint of something like reverence in his voice that if anyone could pull the curtain back on Bradley Summers' little empire of manipulation, it was Sophia Jameson. As she rang the bell, Amelia noticed the faint scratches along the doorframe, the kind of marks that only come from years of packages left unattended and keys jiggled in too many times with shaking hands. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 40s, her dark hair streaked with silver and pulled into a practical twist, eyes sharp behind round wire-framed glasses, and a wariness in her posture that told Amelia this woman had learned the hard way not to trust easily. "You must be Amelia," Sophia said, her voice low and deliberate. "Come in. I don't like talking on the porch." Neighbors here have ears bigger than their gardens. The inside of the house was simple, but full of warmth, handmade quilts draped over armchairs, framed photos of children and birthday cakes, the faint scent of cinnamon, and something herbal hanging in the air. They sat at a small kitchen table where a stack of manila folders sat waiting like ammunition. Jonathan told me you've seen the beginning of it. Sophia began, tapping the folders with a single finger. The picnic is fine. The signs, the smiles that don't reach the eyes. Amelia nodded slowly. I thought it was just me, or just misreading things. Sophia gave a humorless smile. That's what they want you to think. That's your fault. That you're the problem. That you just don't understand how things work around here. She opened the top folder and pulled out a series of printouts emails. Memos, property maps, but it's not you. Amelia, it's a system, a machine, and it starts right here. She tapped a satellite image of Sunridge Meadows with a red line circling the creek. They're after the water. Amelia leaned in. What do you mean? Sophia exhaled, then launched into the story like someone who had told it before, but each time still left a bruise. Bradley's been building toward this for years. Little rules here, minor adjustments there. He paints it as protecting community values, but it's always about squeezing out anyone who doesn't fit. And once you're under enough pressure, you either leave or you break. Then his real estate firm swoops in with a lowball offer. The house gets flipped, sold for a profit. The new owners, always someone from his circle. She pushed another paper forward, a financial disclosure buried in public filings, linking Summers' property holdings to a shell company registered in the Caymans. But that's not the endgame. She opened a second folder, site plans, confidential proposals, letters of intent. He's been negotiating to buy Sunridge Creek from the original developer. The HOA doesn't own it. Not yet. It's under a 30-year lease set to expire in 60 days. But Bradley, he's planning to purchase it privately, not through the HOA, through one of his LLCs. And what's he going to do with it? Sophia flipped to the next page, renderings of luxury townhomes, a private members-only lake lounge, and a paved path that cuts straight through where Ethan and Amelia had once sat by the willow tree. The new rules, the fines, the signs, they're all part of the plan. Restrict access, kill public attachment, and make the land seem like a burden. Then buy it up and sell it back to the wealthy under a different name. Amelia sat back, the room spinning slightly with the weight of what she was seeing. It was methodical, cold, brilliant in its cruelty. She thought of Ethan skipping stones across the creek, his first real smile since James had died, and rage bloomed in her chest like fire licking dry grass. How long have you known? She asked, her voice a low whisper. Sophia looked down at her hands. Long enough to be punished for it. I used to run the neighborhood events committee. When I started asking questions why certain families were always fined, why common areas were being restricted, I was accused of misappropriating funds. My reputation was shredded. My daughter lost her scholarship because of the gossip. People stopped answering my emails. I was erased. Her voice trembled only slightly before she swallowed and met Amelia's gaze again. But I kept the files. Every memo, every update, every backdated regulation. I've been waiting for someone who could do something with them. Amelia felt the weight of that trust settle on her shoulders like armor. Then let's do something, she said, her voice fierce, steady, dangerous. Sophia stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. All right then. Wah, it is. That night, long after Sophia had packed away the damning documents and pressed a folder into Amelia's hands like a loaded weapon, long after the soft creak of her front door had closed and the stars above Sunridge Meadows had begun their quiet dance, Amelia sat alone in her living room, with every lamp dimmed except the one above the desk, her laptop screen casting pale blue light across her features, sharpening the steel now forming behind her eyes. For the first time in nearly 2 years, since the night James's name had flashed across her phone in a call she never wanted to answer, she felt something deeper than grief strategy. It moved through her blood like electricity, precise and cool, honed from years of corporate negotiations and merger battles where men underestimated her until it was too late. Now, she turned that same skill set toward the small but polished world of Sunridge Meadows and the false empire Bradley Summers had built atop it. She began by confirming what Sophia had uncovered, digging into the property history of Sunridge Creek, tracing the 30-year lease that, indeed, was set to expire in exactly 58 days, The current owner was a holding firm called Westbrook Land and Development, a once powerful real estate developer that had taken massive losses during the pandemic and was now liquidating secondary assets to avoid insolvency. Amelia's fingers flew over keys as she pulled corporate filings, tax records, and lien disclosures, and by the time the sun threatened the edges of the sky, she had not only confirmed Westbrook's fragile position, she had located the name of their internal asset manager, a man named Thomas Brinley, whose inbox and voicemail she quietly introduced herself to before Ethan even stirred awake upstairs. The next day, while Ethan attended a coding workshop at the community center, Amelia drove out of the neighborhood for the first time since moving in, careful to take back roads and avoid HOA cameras that, according to Sophia, had been subtly installed throughout Sunridge Meadows under the guise of enhanced neighborhood safety. She met Thomas in a quiet, sun-drenched cafe off the interstate, where he arrived looking harried and exhausted, the sleeves of his dress shirt rolled up and his tie askew. "Ms. Hartwell," he said, extending a clammy hand. "I admit I was surprised by your call." Amelia smiled with polite restraint and slid a crisp manila envelope across the table. "You won't be, not once you see my offer." Inside was a one-page proposal, €380 in cash, with guaranteed close in under 10 business days. No contingencies. His eyebrows rose, then narrowed. "You understand there's another interested party?" "Yes." Amelia cut in smoothly. "Bradley Summers. He's offering 300 flat, in installments, contingent on investor financing that hasn't materialized. And you, Mr. Brinley, are trying to cover a $4.6 million shortfall by quarter end. So the question isn't who wants it more. It's who's going to actually pay you." The man leaned back slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You have a background in acquisitions, don't you?" Amelia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Once upon a time, within 48 hours, the formal purchase agreement had been drafted under an anonymous shell corporation, Ashwood River Trust, registered out of Delaware with a clean record and no public association to Amelia. She arranged financing from her private accounts in 3 staggered tranches, careful to keep her name off every document, every wire transfer, every notary seal. The lake and the 10-foot perimeter around its shoreline would legally belong to her within 2 weeks. Not to the HOA, not to Bradley, her. It was a chess move executed in silence, but even as Amelia played her hand with precision, she could feel the tension in the neighborhood begin to shift like wind before a storm. Bradley must have sensed something, perhaps from her sudden quiet, perhaps from the absence of fear in her posture at the last HOA meeting, but the first sign came when a warning notice appeared on her door. Weed height exceeding HOA ordinance fine, 150. Then came the others. Unauthorized potted plants on porch. Mailbox not in regulation, ivory. Inappropriate recycling bin placement, each citation more ludicrous than the last. Stacked like threats from a petty dictator, furious he couldn't find her weakness. But Amelia no longer flinched. She recorded every violation, documented every inconsistency, and passed them all to Jonathan and Sophia, who had begun organizing a quiet coalition of like-minded neighbors, people who had been shamed, fined, and silenced, people who were now quietly, carefully ready to stand. And still, she said nothing. Not to Bradley, not to the board, not yet. Let him keep believing he held the board. Let him keep tightening his grip on a kingdom he was days away from losing. Amelia would wait. She would wait until the deed was signed, until the property transfer was irrevocable, until every thread of power he thought he had was severed by her hand. And when the time came, she would show all of them. The woman they had tried to intimidate into silence was not only unafraid, she was already winning. It began the way storms always do, in places like Sunridge Meadows, not with thunder or lightning, but with whispers, with sudden silences in places that used to hold polite small talk, with gazes that slid just a moment too quickly to the ground when Amelia passed. The morning after the offer for Sunridge Creek was officially accepted and filed with the county, though still hidden behind the veil of Ashwood River Trust. Amelia opened her front door to find 3 envelopes taped to the glass like warnings. Violations for excessive decorative items, non-standard porch furniture, and improper gutter drainage. All fined, all backdated, all absurd. She stared at them for a moment, then peeled them off one by one with the same precision she had once used to review corporate litigation reports, her expression unreadable. That same day, 2 HOA compliance officers with matching clipboards and manufactured smiles did slow, deliberate laps around her house, not once, not twice, but 5 times, tapping and scribbling as they went, occasionally lifting their phones to take photos with the same kind of smug entitlement that made her skin crawl. But Amelia didn't flinch. Instead, she documented everything. She filmed from her living room. She time-stamped every step, and she waited. The next strike came subtly, but more personal. Ethan came home from school quiet, too quiet, his eyes downcast. His shoulders hunched in that way she had seen only once before, after James's funeral. She knelt beside him gently, her voice soft as a breeze. "Ethan, what happened?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Some kids said we were going to get kicked out. That we don't belong here. That their parents told them you're trying to destroy the neighborhood." Amelia felt her breath catch. Not from surprise, but from the sheer cruelty of it, how quickly Bradley had shifted his campaign from the shadows of the HOA office to the ears of children, poisoning the playground before she could even defend herself. That night, she sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, running her fingers through his hair as he drifted into a restless sleep, and made herself another vow, carved in iron this time. No matter what they said, no matter what they did, she would not let them touch her son again. But Bradley wasn't finished. Over the next 10 days, the violations intensified: trash bin positioning, mailbox height, and window blinds that were supposedly non-neutral in tone. Every letter came with a fine. Every appeal was denied without review. HOA board members began mentioning her name in meetings, never directly, always in veiled language. Certain elements, they said, disruptive new arrivals, individuals with unstable financial interests. At the same time, the residents who had once nodded to her in passing began crossing the street to avoid her. Even Jonathan, though still loyal, reported an uptick in surveillance around his home. Sophia's daughter, now grown and visiting for the weekend, returned to her car to find a neatly folded anonymous flyer tucked beneath her wiper blade. "Your mother cost us peace once. Don't let her do it again." And yet, amid the pressure, something else began to stir. People noticed, people who had quietly endured similar abuse but never had the words for it. People who had been too afraid to act alone, but now saw in Amelia a rallying point, a symbol of resistance not just for herself, but for everyone Bradley had silenced over the years. The secret group chat Jonathan had created began to swell 5 members, then 11, then 17. Homeowners whispered their stories under the hum of porch lights, shared photos of questionable violations, compared HOA notices, and discovered patterns too exact to be coincidence. The more Bradley pushed, the more people opened their eyes. But still, Amelia said nothing publicly. She remained polite at board meetings, calm at community events, focused on Ethan, on rebuilding their peace within the quiet war, because she knew this wasn't the climax. Not yet. This was only the moment the villain grew desperate, unaware that the ground beneath him was already shifting. One grain of truth at a time. The invitation arrived wrapped in gold foil and arrogance. Sunridge Meadows Spring Harmony Celebration. It read, in delicate serif letters too ornate to be sincere. Bradley Summers' signature scrawled elegantly across the bottom alongside a personal message. A time for unity, growth, and vision. Come see the future we're building together. Amelia stared at the card for a full minute before slowly placing it back on the table, her fingers steady, her thoughts anything but. The event was to be held beside Sunridge Creek, the very land she now legally owned, complete with string lights, catered wine bars, and live music sponsored by the HOA budget. Bradley had quietly rerouted through 3 different subcommittees to avoid raising attention. It was a show of force, a performance, an attempt to reassert control and claim victory before the deed to the creek officially changed the hands. But he was already too late. The paperwork had cleared 2 days prior. The signatures were dry, and for the first time in weeks, Amelia allowed herself a real, slow-burning smile. Let him gather his allies. Let him bask in applause. She would give him the stage, then she would burn it down. When Saturday came, the sun shone too brightly, as if even the weather had been bribed to cooperate. Residents arrived in pastel dresses and pressed khakis, clutching reusable wine tumblers and laughing politely beneath canopies of fluttering banners. Bradley stood near the water, shaking hands, posing for photos, his voice floating above the soft jazz like a pastor welcoming his flock. Amelia walked in last, alone, Uninvited, unafraid, she wore simple black slacks and a white blouse, her hair pulled back tight, a folder tucked neatly under one arm. People parted for her without realizing they had. Even those who had whispered behind curtains weeks before now stepped back. Curious, but nervous, she moved through the crowd like a blade through silk. Bradley spotted her as she reached the podium. His smile twitched. "Amelia," he said smoothly, "this is a private event on private property." She replied, her voice crisp as shattered glass. "Yes, let's talk about that." She nodded to the man standing just behind her, Samuel Klein, her real estate attorney, and another figure in uniform. Officer Harris, the local enforcement liaison. A hush fell. Amelia took the mic. "Good afternoon. Some of you know me. Many of you don't. I moved here hoping to find peace, a home for my son, a place to rebuild. What I found instead was exclusion, manipulation, and control disguised as community values." Murmurs rippled. Bradley's eyes narrowed. "What are you trying to pull here?" he snapped, stepping forward. "You have no right. I have the deed," Amelia said simply, and pulled the document from her folder, raising it into the air. "As of 3 days ago, this land, Sunridge Creek, and the 10-foot perimeter surrounding it is legally owned by Ashwood River Trust, and I am its managing trustee." Gasps. Then silence. A perfect, crystalline silence. Bradley lunged forward, grabbing at the paper. "That's impossible. We had negotiations which failed," Amelia said, without looking at him. "Because your offer was too little, too late, and built on credit you don't have." She turned to the crowd. "This event, right now, is trespassing. But I'm not here to punish. I'm here to reveal what's been hidden behind these smiling fences for too long." She motioned to Samuel, who connected his tablet to the presentation screen. One by one, files appeared. HOA fund misappropriations, backdoor LLC connections, fines levied disproportionately on new residents, photos of homes bought at deflated value and flipped under Bradley's companies. Then came the kicker, a site plan titled Sunridge Prestige Estates, detailing a proposal to drain and pave over part of the creek for luxury townhomes, all without a community vote. "This," Amelia said softly, "was never about preserving peace. It was about profit, controlled by a man who weaponized the rules to remove opposition and enrich himself at the expense of the people who trusted him." The silence that followed wasn't still. It was seething. Residents looked at each other, then at Bradley. Several stepped back. A woman near the snack table quietly threw her invitation into a trash can. Officer Harris stepped forward. "Mr. Summers, you and any member of the HOA board found to be operating in violation of public code or under false pretenses may be subject to further investigation." Amelia closed the folder. "You used fear to build a kingdom, Bradley, but fear is a weak foundation. And now it's crumbling." She stepped down from the platform as the gathering fractured into chaos behind her questions. Shouting, disbelief. She didn't need to say another word. The truth had spoken for her, and it was louder than any fine could ever be. The fallout from the Spring Harmony celebration rolled through Sunridge Meadows like a thunderclap caught in a bottle, silent only for a moment before everything shattered. Within hours of Amelia's public reveal, the carefully curated illusion of control Bradley Summers had spent nearly a decade constructing began to crack. Residents who had once parroted his talking points now questioned them. Those who had feared him now whispered with each other, compared notes, compared fines, compared wounds. But Bradley did not go quietly. Desperation is a dangerous fuel, and in the days that followed, he burned it like wildfire. The morning after the event, Amelia awoke to find a notice pinned not to her front door but to her mailbox. A subtle shift in tactic that made her stomach turn. Pending environmental review. Suspected illegal contaminants detected in Sunridge Creek. HOA emergency oversight enacted. All usage suspended indefinitely. Attached was a formal complaint filed with the city, bearing Bradley's signature and an expedited request for exclusive environmental authority. Amelia read it twice, then again, and then she laughed, low and bitter. The man was trying to poison the land she had already won metaphorically. Perhaps literally before she could claim it outright. But he wasn't finished. That same week, building inspectors arrived at her property unannounced, citing obscure code violations from renovations completed by the home's previous owners years ago. The deck railing, the outdoor light fixtures, the spacing between garden pavers, all now suddenly non-compliant. She received letters questioning the legitimacy of Ashwood River Trust, Anonymous tip-offs were made to zoning boards. Rumors began to swirl that she had used foreign money to buy the creek. On a community bulletin board outside the HOA office, a flyer appeared overnight. Who is Amelia Hartwell really working for? Her face was printed beneath in grayscale, pixelated and grainy, like a mugshot from some alternate universe. But Amelia didn't bend. She countered every complaint with documentation, filed rebuttals, involved her attorney. She knew this playbook too well. When a system is crumbling, it will do anything to defend itself, even cannibalize its creator. And it was working. Not against her, but against Bradley. The smear tactics were too obvious now. The timing too convenient. Residents who had remained neutral were beginning to speak out, not loudly. Not all at once, but with questions at HOA meetings, with polite refusals to sign petitions, with soft no's at doorsteps, where once there had been silent nods. And then came the moment that broke the dam. Saffida Jensen, a long silent HOA board member whose flower shop lease Bradley had once dangled like a leash, stood up during a public meeting and laid bare the truth. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. "I've served under Bradley for 5 years," she said, "and I've watched him turn this board from a service into a sword. I've seen neighbors punished for asking questions. I've seen funds redirected, concerns ignored, voices silenced. And I've been complicit because I was afraid." Her voice broke then, but she didn't stop. "But I'm not afraid anymore, because someone showed us how to stand up. Because Amelia Hartwell reminded us that this community doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to all of us." The room was silent for 2 full seconds. Then applause. Then standings. Then floodgates. Other residents began speaking. About fines. About threats. About how their children had been excluded from school groups. How elderly neighbors had been pushed to sell their homes after dozens of small violations drained their savings. In less than an hour, the HOA board meeting had transformed into something entirely new. A reckoning. Amelia stood at the back of the room, saying nothing, her arms crossed tightly, her heart thudding not with anxiety, but with awe. This was no longer just her fight. It belonged to all of them now. And Bradley, standing stiff at the front of the room, surrounded not by loyalists but by silence, understood for the first time what true isolation felt like. His grip was slipping, and this time there would be no saving throw. The days that followed were unlike anything Sunridge Meadows had ever seen. Gone were the clipped silences and manicured facades of false civility. In their place rose whispers that grew into questions, questions that sharpened into voices, and voices that eventually roared into demands. The community was no longer afraid. Fueled by Saphira's public stand and emboldened by the truths Amelia had unearthed, residents gathered not just in living rooms or behind closed doors, but in open driveways, around fire pits, in church basements and cafe corners. Flyers began to circulate. HOA accountability meeting this Saturday. No longer authorized by the board, no longer approved, but no one cared. By Saturday, over 100 people packed into the community center. There were no name tags, no podiums, no opening remarks, only voices raw, tired, clear telling their stories. A father whose daughter had been denied access to the community pool because she played too loudly. A retired veteran fined repeatedly for displaying a flag not on approved rotation days. A couple who had moved here for peace only to be fined into near foreclosure for non-compliant garden shapes. And always, the common thread, fear, isolation, silence. Until now, at the front sat Amelia, silent as ever, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The documents she had assembled over weeks now compiled into a single binder, passed from hand to hand. She didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her work had already done the talking. Jonathan stood and proposed the motion. Effective immediately, we call for a full audit of the HOA's financial records, the suspension of all current board operations, and the initiation of a community-wide vote to elect new leadership. Bound by revised bylaws and term limits, applause erupted. Sophia seconded the motion. Then came the vote. Ballots were cast not by app, but on paper real. Tangible, undeniable. Within an hour, the results were read aloud. 89% in favor of dissolving the current board, 93% in favor of electing a transitional ethics committee, and an overwhelming call for a forensic audit of all financial dealings under Bradley's tenure. Amelia exhaled slowly, the weight lifting from her chest, not all at once, but piece by piece. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because Bradley, cornered, stripped of his command, did what men like him always do. He lashed out. He filed a cease and desist letter through his attorney claiming defamation, property interference, character damage. He attempted to freeze HOA accounts, insisted on his contractual right to finish his term. But the tide had turned. The city clerk's office, now flooded with resident complaints, began its own inquiry. And the final blow came when a clerk from the county zoning office, tipped off by a member of the ethics committee, leaked an internal memo showing Bradley had submitted falsified environmental reports in an effort to condemn the creek land just before Amelia's purchase. That, combined with the financial inconsistencies Samuel Klein presented to the community's legal review panel, was enough. Bradley Summers was removed from the HOA registry, charged with fraud, misuse of community funds, and falsifying regulatory documents. His real estate license was suspended pending further investigation. Within a month, he quietly listed his home. No one attended the open house. Meanwhile, change took root. The new ethics committee drafted an interim charter, term limits, transparent budget disclosures, resident voting rights on all major policy changes. Sapphira was named interim president. Sophia chaired the communications subcommittee. And Amelia declined every title offered. "I didn't do this to lead," she told them. "I did it so we could all breathe again." But they named her something else instead. Quietly, unanimously, a plaque was unveiled beside the newly restored banks of Sunridge Creek, its waters finally clear again under a new community conservation program. It read, "This space is dedicated to those who stand when it's easier to sit, who speak when it's safer to stay silent. To Amelia Hartwell, who reminded us we belong." She stood there with Ethan one morning as the sun spilled gold across the water, his hand wrapped in hers. The world quieter, better. And for the first time since James's death, since the move, since the first warning notice, Amelia allowed herself to believe something she hadn't dared hope for. They weren't just surviving. They had built something worth protecting. It started with a question. Ethan had been sitting beside the creek one quiet morning, the soles of his sneakers barely touching the water, when he turned to Amelia and asked, "Do the frogs remember what it was like before?" She paused, the way parents do when their children cut through years of noise with a single innocent blade. "Before," she echoed gently. "Before all the yelling, the fences, the signs telling them where they're allowed to sit." Amelia looked out at the water, where new reeds had begun to grow along the banks. No longer torn up by the endless landscaping Bradley's regime had demanded to keep the view pristine. Dragonflies danced across the surface in lazy spirals. The frogs had returned, so had the children, so had the peace. "Maybe," she said finally, "maybe they don't remember, maybe they just start over." That afternoon, she began writing a proposal not to the HOA, not to the ethics committee, but directly to the people who would inherit this place long after any board term expired. It was called Creek Keepers, a hands-on youth program built around conservation, ecology, and community care, hosted entirely around Sunridge Creek. Its motto was simple: know the land, and you'll protect it. Within 2 weeks, she had 6 volunteers, 4 borrowed fishing poles, a folding table with laminated guides to native plant life, and a dozen children showing up every Saturday morning with clipboards, journals, and questions she didn't always know how to answer. And it didn't matter, because they were there, because they were listening, because they were seeing. She watched as Ethan explained to a younger boy how to recognize tadpole clusters. The light in his eyes, not just curiosity, but ownership, not of land, but of purpose. She watched a girl who had never spoken above a whisper stand beside a parent and point out trash caught in the reeds, then organize a cleanup without waiting for permission. The program grew faster than expected. A retired biologist in the neighborhood offered to help. A local school district asked if they could visit. Even a regional conservation organization reached out about forming a partnership. But the moment that stayed with Amelia most came on a rainy Sunday, when she arrived early to check the creek and found a small group of children already there, ponchos pulled tight, huddled under a wide tree, protecting a paper notebook from the drizzle. "We didn't want to cancel." One of them said simply, "The frogs are still here, so we should be too." Amelia turned her face slightly, letting the rain hide the tears she didn't want to explain. Later that week, the ethics committee asked again if she would consider taking a formal position, maybe even in the next election cycle. She declined again, but with a smile this time. "You already gave me the only title I ever wanted," she said, nodding toward the creek where Ethan stood teaching 3 smaller kids how to build a proper observation perch from fallen branches. Caretaker, and that was enough. Sometimes the greatest victories are the quietest ones, the ones where no headlines are written. No photos are taken, no banners are hung, only the laughter of children, the ripple of clean water, and the echo of a community finding its way back to itself, one Saturday at a time. 1 year later, on a morning stitched with birdsong and the gentle shimmer of early light on water, Amelia stood once again at the edge of Sunridge Creek, the soles of her shoes brushing the familiar reeds, the air sweet with the scent of honeysuckle blooming wildly along the restored bank. A new bench had been installed beneath the willow tree, the one where she and Ethan had first tried to find healing, back when this place had been quiet for all the wrong reasons. Now, the silence was different. Now, it was sacred. The annual Creek Keepers Spring Gathering was in full swing behind her, dozens of families chatting, children comparing field notebooks. A volunteer dad grilling veggie skewers beside a table labeled Invasive Species ID Station. What had once been her quiet resistance had become something bigger than she could have imagined, something living and pulsing through the roots of this place. And yet, the bench was empty. For now, Amelia sat alone for a moment, letting the wind braid itself through her hair, her hands resting in her lap as the sun warmed the crown of her head. She thought about James not with sorrow this time, but with a quiet, full gratitude. How it had all begun with his loss. How she had taken that pain and, somehow, turned it into protection. Not just for Ethan, but for others. The sound of footsteps pulled her gently from her thoughts. Ethan, now taller than her, with stronger shoulders and the confident stride of someone who knew exactly who he was becoming, approached with 2 mugs of cocoa. The committee voted, he said, handing her one. They want to name the next conservation trail after you. Amelia arched an eyebrow. You mean the one that loops through the southern woods? He grinned. They're calling it Hartwell Path. She looked at him, heart fluttering in a way that only a mother could understand, somewhere between disbelief and fierce, unstoppable love. Did you vote for that? She teased. Nope, he said, sitting beside her. I proposed it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze lifted the corners of a flyer pinned to the nearby corkboard. Creek Keepers Summer Camp Registration. Now open. Volunteers welcome. Amelia took a sip from her cup, the cocoa already cooling. It's not about my name. You know, she said softly. It's about remembering what it took to earn this peace. Ethan nodded. I know, but I also know it wouldn't be here without you. She looked out over the creek, watching a group of small children lower a handmade water sensor into the stream, their instructor explaining nitrate levels in terms of rainbow colors. Nearby, a teenager handed out laminated cards detailing ways to reduce fertilizer runoff. This was the real inheritance. Not property, not paperwork, not titles, but awareness, stewardship, courage passed from one hand to the next, like a lantern through darkness. Maybe they won't remember the rules we broke, Amelia whispered, mostly to herself, but maybe they'll remember why we broke them. Ethan reached over and laced his fingers through hers. I will, he said, and as the creek sang quietly beneath the sky, as children laughed and sunlight flickered through a canopy of leaves no longer trimmed for appearances, but left wild for protection, Amelia Hartwell closed her eyes and finally, rested. Amelia never wanted power. She wanted peace. But when the system came after her child, she fought back with more than anger. She fought with wisdom, strategy, and quiet strength. And when it was all over, she didn't keep the victory for herself. She gave it to every child who would one day sit beside that creek and know they belonged. If this story moved you, if you believe that quiet strength can change everything, leave a comment below. Share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, because the world needs more stories where justice is quiet and unstoppable.